Kayla Sabharwal is a customer success manager at SeamlessMD, where she manages the relationship for a portfolio of customers and works to ensure they meet the goals they set for our platform. She has a bachelor in biology and an MBA, both from Dalhousie University. She started her career at EY in their finance consulting division in Halifax before moving home to Toronto and into EY's national healthcare practice. There, she worked with a number of Canadian hospitals to improve service delivery and to streamline operations with new technologies. Her passion lies in improving patient care and health system efficiency through digital tools. Outside of work, Kayla loves to travel and is an avid scuba diver. Kayla, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I had a feeling Alan was going to come knocking soon.
And what a better time to do it than the first episode of the year. Kayla, we're so excited to have you here and kicking off the podcast for 2021. Today, we're actually going to be talking about post-op monitoring and using digital patient engagement for post-op monitoring. But to start, Kayla, I think your story is really impactful as well. As I mentioned in the bio, you started in EY and worked on a lot of different healthcare initiatives with different Canadian hospitals. So the place that I wanted to start was, do you have a list or a few that were maybe the most impactful initiatives that you worked on while you were at EY?
Yeah, sure. I can share a couple examples. One in particular, which was one of my favorite projects, was a provincial review of electronic health record systems. And so for this particular province, we were hired by the Ministry of Health to come in and do a review of 3 different EHRs that were being used across the province. So they found that the majority of people across primary care, acute care, and community care were all using a mix of 3 different systems. And so the objective for us was to come in and do a review to identify areas of duplication. So duplication in data and databases that the systems had, as well as functionality. So things such as secure messaging or the ability to handle fax referrals internally. And the point of doing this review was to really help define a future state architecture model as they were looking to transition to being more connected and integrated. So a big part of that was doing a jurisdictional scan of other countries and provinces to see how they were doing in terms of how they were operating in a more modern and open health ecosystem, and having those kind of drive what recommendations we gave to that province. So that one was really interesting.
Actually, and then, might I ask you a quick question on that? Because I'm just more curious from like the role that like a consulting firm such as E&Y would play. What would be the reason why that Ministry of Health would seek like your past consulting firm's help on something like this, as opposed to them internally doing this province-wide review? Do you have a sense of like why they would kind of go outside for that, as opposed to tasking some committee in-house to do that?
Yeah, definitely. So the biggest reason why is resource constraints. They have a lot of committees and a lot of initiatives that they're running, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to bring in or to reallocate those groups to doing this kind of review. And then secondly is because the Ministry of Health really kind of has some say over some of the hospitals and other pieces, but they don't have as much of a grip on community care sector as well. So there's a lot of kind of bringing in a third party who has some expertise and knowledge of these topics as a good kind of fresh set of eyes to attack the problem.
Also, I guess maybe, I don't know, maybe you're a little bit less biased in some way too, so it doesn't feel like the conclusion is being directed in one way or another.
Exactly, yeah. Having that kind of fresh set third party who's a little bit indifferent, it's a good perspective to have coming in.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And sorry, I think there was another initiative you were going to talk about.
Yeah, I was going to talk about one a little bit on, the complete end of, in terms of kind of scale. But one of my favorite types of projects to work on while I was at EY was RPA initiative. So that's Robotic Process Automation. And what that's all about is basically automating really repetitive and transactional processes that are entirely rules-based. So for example, one that we automated was the submission of invoices to the ministry. And so someone has to open the screen and click on this and enter this set of login credentials and then open this Excel file to find a code, and all of it is entirely rules-based. So you can kind of work out the automated process, and the RPA code can just be overlaid on top of your existing systems without you having to integrate or really introduce a new technology. So it's really small. The benefits of automating a process like that maybe saves a couple of minutes each time the process is run. which sounds really small, but it's a good example of how small victories can really add up to big results, because you automate a few more processes and all of a sudden you're at savings of a whole FTE. And now those resources have more time to dedicate to more value add tasks instead. So that was a good one too.
Totally. And I imagine, as it gets rolled out across many different organizations as well, the impact is, exponential from there.
Yeah, exactly. It may only sound like seconds saved, but it really adds up.
Right. In terms of, these two initiatives that you've mentioned, what were some of the biggest challenges, or sorry, let me backtrack, any of the initiatives that you worked on while you were at EY, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in either implementing the solutions or working with these, multiple stakeholders that you had to engage? What were some of the big challenges you faced?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say probably fiscal and resource constraints were the biggest barriers that we ran into. You can have the most innovative and intelligent and motivated team, but that's not enough to drive transformation. There really needs to be all the kind of fiscal and resource support behind it in order to drive that. So that's something that we found. We can come in and do these reviews and give some recommendations and a great implementation plan, but unless the hospitals have the resources to act on it, then that was kind of the barrier.
So I guess, Kayla, one of the unique things about COVID-19, as terrible as it is for the world, it kind of brought people together to solve the same problem, right? So whereas in the past, maybe if there was no COVID-19 2020, everyone still has 10 different things that, they're all working on. But now everyone's focused on something COVID related to try and help solve those problems happening today. So maybe just a segue over to kind of some stuff that you're doing here at Seamless and getting to post-op monitoring. So, one of the really cool initiatives you're leading here at Seamless is this Supercluster project that relates a lot to actually post-op monitoring. Do you mind maybe sharing a little bit more background on what that is and what you're doing there?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really exciting project. It's been taking up the majority of my time these days. But the Supercluster project is a federally funded initiative that's being driven by Canada's technology and digital supercluster, which is Vancouver-based, and it's one of 5 Canadian superclusters that the Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development is funding. And the purpose of it is to really enable Canadian hospitals to be pioneers in leveraging machine learning-based digital patient engagement technologies. And Seamless was selected to lead this because our platform facilitates just that. In terms of the scope of the project, it's kind of in 3 parts. One is a more general version of the SeamlessMD care pathway to be rolled out across multiple surgery types. Preoperatively, this includes COVID-19 symptom screening before each of the times a patient would go into the hospital, as well as some general education about their surgery and about COVID-19. And then postoperatively, we're still doing the symptom monitoring on a daily basis. However, because it's for multiple surgery types, it's more of the recovery symptoms that are applicable across all of them. So things like pain levels, anxiety, mobility that apply to all patient types. Part 2 of the scope is the integrations that we're doing. So we, with all of the hospital partners participating, we're integrating with their scheduling systems. And that is to facilitate automatic sign-up of patients as soon as their surgery is scheduled. And this is really great because it means that nobody has to sit at the surgeon's office and manually sign up each of their patients individually to Seamless. So for a kind of more enterprise rollout, it's really crucial. So it's great that we can do that. And then the third piece of the scope here is the machine learning and analytics component. And so this is where our vendor partners come in. So we're working with AltaML, XLR, and Xeris, who are really leading the machine learning model development and the analytics dashboards and integrations that go along with that. And this is a really exciting piece because we're basically taking the de-identified historical outcomes data from all of our hospital partners, combining them together along with the new data that we're collecting through the supercluster patients, and training the machine learning model to predict patients who might be at higher risk of surgical cancellations, readmissions, or ER visits. So it's really a great enhancement to remote monitoring. Once we're able to add those risk prediction scores to the dashboards, it will really help the providers and the care teams more easily triage and manage their patient population.
I mean, this is pretty incredible. I mean, I know a lot of people talk about how COVID has brought, digital transformation 10 years forward. But it's almost as if that's easier to do in other industries in healthcare, but it really has happened in healthcare in many ways as well. I mean, the things that you're describing are in many ways more sophisticated than even standing up telemedicine, right? You're talking about actually enrolling patients into a digital patient engagement platform. You're talking about all these integrations with EHRs and the whole machine learning piece where hospitals are actually collaborating with companies like ours to share this de-identified data, to train models. I don't think that would have happened for maybe a couple of years, to be honest. At least getting to the machine learning piece and being able to collaborate with data. I don't think that would happen for a couple of years if not for COVID. So that's actually pretty unprecedented. Wanted to ask you, Kayla, so normally, right, when we talk about SeamlessMD with providers and health systems, usually they're implementing Seamless like a very specific care plan. So maybe they're implementing something specific for heart surgery or a knee replacement or chemotherapy or something else. But it sounds like what you're doing with this Supercluster project is actually getting all of these surgical patients on a very standardized care plan on Seamless. They're all tracking the same symptoms. They're not getting something that's very specific to one clinical use case or another. And there's probably pros and cons to that. Could you talk a bit about like what goes into this sort of more generalized solution and how has that changed how like our team has approached implementing the product with customers?
Yeah, definitely. So at its core, this is basically just a more general version of a care pathway. So if you take the patient's to-do list that we give them that updates every day, instead of saying something specific like stop taking your anti-inflammatory medications 7 days before surgery, we may instead say stop taking your medications before surgery as instructed by your healthcare team. And so we find that this reminder alone is very effective at keeping patients on track, which is the overall goal of these to-do lists. And postoperatively, when you're looking at remote monitoring, we still ask patients for all of these different signs of complications, such as pain levels at their surgical site, signs of a DVT, signs of a wound infection, opioid use and tracking, and giving patients that automatic feedback and recommendations what action they could take once they report all these symptoms really does answer the vast majority of their questions, even though those symptoms aren't as tailored or customized to their specific surgery type. So it's a great benefit, especially from an enterprise perspective, to roll this out at a more larger scale to different surgery types, especially since a lot of health systems are now trying to minimize the number of vendors that they have. And then from the surgeon's perspective, it's a great way to be introduced to Seamless and get a feel for it without having to be committed necessarily to the more lengthy implementation and content development that goes into a fully customized line. And they can try it out, and if they want to expand to be more customized for their patients later, they can always do that.
When you're kind of designing this more kind of standardized care plan for, let's say, across the whole surgical program at a hospital, so normally if we were, if Alan and I were both, on the orthopedics team, we'd all be working with you, let's say, and in your team at Seamless, but I'm guessing you're not working with, 200 surgeons to design this. How is that working out? Like, are you getting like representatives from like one surgeon from each department gets to weigh in on what goes into this, or how are you sort of facilitating that process now?
Yeah, exactly what you just said. So we typically have now 1 or 2 representatives from each surgery group, typically one surgeon that's been named by their group to represent them, as well as a supporting nurse if there's one available. And they'll basically be responsible for reviewing and approving the content, getting feedback from their teams, and then our role kind of becomes managing and coordinating all the feedback between the groups to make sure that everything aligns. What's really important though is that they come in with the understanding and expectations that this is meant to be shared across multiple surgery types. So we haven't run into that many issues around that. Everyone's been really cooperative so far. So the content development piece is a little quicker than our normal process because we start with a really solid template for them to review. It's when we get into the training and onboarding where the process becomes a little lengthy because there are a lot more bodies to train and a lot more people to kind of be brought up to speed and made aware of Seamless and when it's coming. And so a really strong communication plan to be spread out through the hospital from the project sponsors, trickling down from administrative executives to all the surgeon department heads, the surgeons, their supporting nurses, the administrative assistants. It's really critical.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned working with providers and hospitals is, especially when there's so many stakeholders, never to assume that everything that you've discussed with the organization has actually been shared broadly, not because they don't want to, but because there's so much going on. So much information gets lost along the way. So I feel like you're often probably having to repeat context probably with everyone that you're speaking with to make sure like they're all on the same page, they know what's going on. I think we've had meetings where people just get invited and they have no idea that Seamless is an organization. Not sure that's happened.
Definitely, because they try and give everyone a heads up, but at the end of the day, not everyone who needs to be trained about Seamless was directly involved in the implementation and content development. So there is a lot of that. I could probably rehearse our little presentation in my sleep now.
That's funny. Can I ask you? Sorry, Ali, I don't mean to jump in.
It's okay. No, you hijack it. It's great. I love these questions.
Okay, thanks. Well, hopefully you love this one. But I was wondering. I know, as you mentioned, our team came up with this template for the surgery care, the generic surgery care plan, so that we can get off the ground more quickly with these partners. But I was wondering, when you look at all the different hospitals that are involved in this and how they ended up customizing that template further, are you finding that the final version is really that different between different organizations? Or are they mostly just like taking it as is and making very minimal changes? Or are they all making the same changes? Kind of wondering like how different hospitals are kind of what the final product looks like for them.
Yeah, it's a great question. The differences really come in, we're finding with the COVID screening protocols, and then the general information about the hospital, really. The actual clinical content, the post-op symptom surveys that we're pushing to patients, there is a lot less customization that goes into those between hospitals. It's just more what their internal processes are around screening patients for COVID symptoms before they arrive at the hospital, and how our platform can facilitate and match that workflow. So sometimes it's the timing of events that go out to patients. Sometimes it's the questions in the COVID screening themselves. That's where we're seeing a little bit of variability, but less so with the to-do list and post-op piece. It's more around the COVID screening.
And at this point, are these different organizations actually talking to each other about this initiative, or is it still very much like on their own, like we're working with each of them and they're kind of doing it their own way? Like how much collaboration at this point are they actually doing between different centers?
Mm-hmm. Most of the collaboration is just trying to figure out how each is been handling the integrations. So of the 4 Ontario hospitals that we're currently implementing this at, some are on Epic, some are on Sunrise, some are on Cerner. And so looking at what changes they made to each of those systems for their hospital partner or colleagues that are using the same system, that's kind of where the collaboration's been going. And it's been more them wondering, well, what are they doing and how are they handling this, and us kind of sharing best practices back and forth.
Mm-hmm. And Kayla, actually, there's a little bit to unpack there. I'm curious, what are the common types of integrations that people are doing with the EHRs? Like what specifically is being integrated for post-op monitoring?
Mm-hmm. So for post-op monitoring, specifically what we're doing is basically making SeamlessMD available for providers to launch from within whichever charting system they're using. So we've done this, I know we've talked about it on a previous podcast episode of our integration partnerships with Epic and Cerner, but more recently with our Canadian hospitals, we've been doing integrations with Allscripts and Meditech. And it basically just means that when a provider is in their patient's chart, there's a button for them to click on Seamless so they can launch the Seamless platform and view all the data that we collect easily. And it just makes it that much more easy, instead of a provider having to open a web browser and go to the Seamless link, enter their login credentials, find the patient, and then view the data. It just really makes that process a little bit quicker. And when you're thinking about an enterprise rollout, it's really crucial because it makes everyone a bit more efficient. It saves them time. It makes the staff happier, which
it's
helps
easier
with
to
uptake
use.
and buy-in. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in terms of the actual monitoring of patients, like who's commonly doing that? It's not the surgeons, is it the nurses actually monitoring these patients? Are they doing it like day to day, or how does that work?
Mm-hmm. So it's typically a nurse that we see in that role. sometimes a care coordinator or a nurse navigator. Sometimes it's the surgeon office admins who are receiving alerts on symptoms and then escalating those directly to their surgeon. It really depends on the structure of each clinic and each team of how they're resourced. When we're looking at the supercluster initiatives, for example, at a more larger scale rollout, the question kind of becomes, does each group, each surgery department want to handle their notifications and their monitoring separately, or do they want to centralize it and have a dedicated resource responsible for triaging the symptoms and alerts for the multiple surgery types?
Right.
So that's kind of the question. And yeah, exactly. We've seen a mix. It really depends on funding and resource availability to do that. And that's kind of the tricky part about workflow, because if they are going to handle them separately, there needs to be some element of consistency. So the coordination around that it's very dependent on each hospital.
Yeah, I guess the tricky thing too is if you're kind of in the surgery department shoes, if your own team is the one doing it, they often have more context about that patient. So they may remember the patient. They know what complications are typical for that surgery type. But then you have to have every department deciding if they're going to maybe train their team and have them available. But if you centralize it, then it's a bit easier to have a single team to manage on top of it. But then they have like no context. They're probably doing some very more basic triaging. Everything gets routed back to the surgery probably anyways. It's kind of like if you had in Ontario we have is it called telehealth still? That central nursing line you call it? Yeah. It's kind of a weird name actually, telehealth, to call that telehealth. But you call it and they always tell you to go to the ER because everything sounds bad on the phone.
8 out of 10 times at least. Yeah. No, totally.
So Kate, I guess one question I had for you also was in terms of when you're doing such a large enterprise rollout of this, what are the, I guess, communication strategies these organizations are going to use in terms of educating patients on this? So just for folks who aren't aware, I think normally, correct me if I'm wrong, Kayla, but if it was just a focused department using something like Seamless, the frontline staff are being trained on how to educate patients, and then they end up onboarding them directly, et cetera, either through, I guess, the EHR or through our portal. But with the integrated version, there's a lot of, I guess, mass onboarding happening through the integration for patients. Do you have a sense of how organizations are planning to communicate this at scale for patients? What's sort of the current thinking around this right now?
Yeah, so the actual kind of upfront education for patients about SeamlessMD isn't as different. It's just a little bit easier. So all patients are still going through their individual surgeon's offices, and it's the surgeon's office who are booking the patient surgery or making the booking request. And so it's that booking request that's our trigger point to automatically sign up the patients. So there's opportunity still for all of the surgeons' offices to tell patients about Seamless, but the process that they need to go to do that is a little bit less lengthy than our regular. So they have a short consent script that the privacy teams at the hospitals have provided that they read to patients. Patients will verbally consent. They'll give them the brochure, and then they can book through their OR manager or scheduling system. And what we've been doing is adding a field into that scheduling form for the patient's email address, as well as their consent to use Seamless. And those are the fields that the integration is pulling from. So it's still the surgeon's office that are educating patients about Seamless. It's a little bit less effort. And I know as well that the hospitals are also going to be adding some information about SeamlessMD to their main website. So if a patient kind of hears about it passively, they can look at it there, and the brochure and instructions on how to be enrolled will be available there.
That's great.
That makes sense.
Kayla, because this is a lot more general, it's a more broad kind of program that hits on every patient that's going through surgery. How do you define its success with the teams, with the admin, the execs? How do you define the success of this post-op monitoring program?
So it's a great question. There are a couple of ways we're kind of thinking about it. One is being feedback from our nurses and surgeons, and really the people who are receiving any alerts or notifications about certain symptoms. So their experience of using the system and the benefit that it's adding, their feedback is really important. As well as patient engagement. So looking at our activation rates of patients, so those that actually activate their account and move into the program, and the response rates to the surveys If we have high patient engagement, then it's more and better data for the clinical team to work with. So that's a great way of measuring the success of it as well. Patient feedback is important. Often we get a lot of feedback from patients saying that it made them feel so reassured and comforted to receive a phone call from their nurse based on something they submitted through the Seamless app. So that's great as well. And then the last one I would say is our outcomes analysis, which is when we compare patients enrolled in Seamless versus patients not enrolled in Seamless, and we look at their outcomes. So whether or not they were readmitted into the hospital after surgery, or if they went to the ER after surgery as well. So that kind of comparison is telling.
Yeah, it's great. In terms of kind of past success that we've had with more customized programs, I know SeamlessMD has had a tremendous impact on some of those outcomes, like readmissions dropping by 72% at like Bay State Health, for instance. I think over actually closer to home, Sinai Health System in Toronto, they dropped, I believe, like 66% readmissions. There was a little bit on the actual like how the post-op monitoring works. There was a little bit to unpack that I wanted to just share with our audience, because I feel like that's often overlooked. And at least for myself, when I hear post-op monitoring, I'm thinking, okay, we're tracking symptoms. And then, like you said, maybe an alert sends through to the nurses and they can call the patient. But there's actually a bit more involved in how the post-op monitoring works with digital patient engagement, like the self-care recommendations and things like that. Do you mind just kind of touching on how that process looks, or how the actual post-op monitoring looks with digital patient engagement?
Yeah, definitely. So this post-op monitoring at its core is really collecting recovery and symptom data for the patients, and then making that available for their healthcare team to see, to assess, to determine if a follow-up is needed, to really help with quicker intervention. But on the patient side, it's also giving them an ability to report their symptoms. And they're given a recommendation at the conclusion of each survey where they report their symptoms. They're told whether or not they should go to the ER. They can manage their problems at home with some self-care tips in our education library, if they need to call their surgery team to report or discuss something in particular. So it really empowers the patient with the information they need to be an active participant in their care and manage their health. And I'll also say they're for patient caregivers as well. So whether it's a spouse or a child or whoever's taking care of a patient at home, the content on the app, the education and the self-care tips is really empowering caregivers to be able to have the information they need to be helpful and to help manage that patient's care as well. So patients always go home with some guidance and some advice, even if their results aren't being monitored 24/7. And that mixed with the early interventions from the healthcare team is really leading to improved outcomes.
Yeah, one thing I think about for post-op monitoring is that in many ways it is different than traditional remote patient monitoring that I think we generally think of for more chronic illnesses. So when we think of remote monitoring for heart failure, we're thinking of, okay, you got to have, Bluetooth connected weight scales and, heart rate monitors and all these other, devices connected to you. But what's really interesting about surgery is that so many of these symptoms are actually either subjective or there's no device that can capture that data. So what's your pain? Well, pain is subjective. Or are you nauseous? There's no device to capture, nausea very easily. Are you having signs of a blood clot, a DVT in your calf? Okay, there's no device that can easily, just like monitor that in real time. And so there's all these things where actually you do need the patient to self-report that. And that's actually quite unique for surgery. And then for surgery, like a lot of those points that Kayla, you mentioned, we're tracking across the board, whether it's a cardiac or a knee surgery or gallbladder surgery. Everyone needs to subjectively track those and benefits from that tracking, going back to pain, nausea, vomiting, and all that. So that actually is kind of unique when it comes to surgery. A lot of it can be done by the patient. In fact, that's probably why we started there from a Seamless point of view many years ago. It's because you could have the patient be empowered to track it. So it's kind of funny how. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kayla. You're going to say something.
No, I was gonna say, not only is it unique, but our providers don't have another way of collecting this information right now other than waiting for the patient to call them or calling the patient just to check in. So it's a great way of introducing that functionality to them.
Absolutely. Awesome. Alan, were there any other topics you want, around the supercluster process monitoring that you wanted to dive into with Kayla today?
No, I mean, I think we did the, post-op monitoring at its core. I think we did that justice. To Josh's earlier point about the Ontario telehealth, it seems like this is kind of the telehealth 2.0. It's kind of like that background collection and also feeding the patient the right information and kind of that virtual care component as well. So I think that's really great. Maybe the last question that I would have for you, Kayla, when it comes to actually, implementing a solution like this and integrating like new workflows or optimizing existing workflows in the hospital setting or across an entire surgical department or even health system, why do you think it's so difficult to actually do that?
It's a great question. And the short answer is because it requires so many different stakeholders to be involved in this. So not only is it impacting clinical workflows, clinical decision-making, frontline staff, all the way up to their surgeons, but it's also impacting the IT department of the hospital, as well as anyone kind of in an administrative or operational role who's kind of overseeing and trying to make sure there's some consistency and safe and sound workflows and escalation processes. So there are so many different people involved, and getting buy-in for across all those different channels and types of stakeholders takes a lot of communication, a lot of meeting, a lot of back and forth and iterations of these workflows. So that's kind of why it's a bit more challenging. But everyone comes in with, the same goal of improving patient care and improving how efficient and connected that they can be. So an app like Seamless, where we're giving them the information to act better and act faster, the response has been really great.
Right. Can I add just one more quick thing on the post-op monitoring topic? It just kind of came to mind after Alan, you brought up the telehealth thing again. Like normally, if you didn't have this as a patient, if you have a symptom, unless you actually catch it, right? You're probably going back to your local healthcare provider, right? Whether that's your local family, physician or someone else in the community. Especially if you live 3 hours away from the hospital you got your surgery at. But I think one of the really important things here is that if your own, surgery team, the one that did the surgery, knows the context, is one monitoring you, and you catch something, they can actually better direct you to what you probably should do based on your context, your medical history, your surgery type, whether that is coming back in a clinic or dealing with it over the phone or going to the ER if you have to. But when you randomly end up in a random hospital or ER department who has no context for what happened to you before that visit, you can sometimes get the wrong treatment plan. Like I remember I had a family member who was readmitted, and even though it was further to go back to the hospital they had their surgery at, it was better that they did, because they knew the context around everything, right? And in fact, that family member needed more treatment, and so they were able to get treated by the same team again. And so it just made me think about how the monitoring actually just makes it more likely the patient gets better treatment if they need it, because the team knows you. And in fact, here's the other thing, right? As you know very well, these health records still don't talk to each other between most hospitals. So you go to this, you end up at a different hospital, they can't access the records. You hope that it gets faxed over. Who knows how long that will take and how long it takes to sift through that. So anyways, I'll stop kind of preaching that, but it just made me think about that. It's just, the patient will probably get better care just because they're being monitored by the team that knows them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it's funny, actually, if anybody would know that, it's Kayla from her work with EY and literally working on that exact project, that initiative. Yeah. That's great. So Kayla, at this point, we want to jump over to the Fast 5 lightning round just to get to know you a little bit better. Our audience wants to get to know you. So we have 5 questions prepared. You can answer them as quickly as you'd like, or if you're like Josh and myself, you can take as long as you want. But we'll start with number 1. So first question is, what is your favorite book or book that you've gifted the most?
Oh, that's a really great question. To be honest, I can't say that I've gifted books a lot, but I'll talk about a book that I was recently gifted that's just top of mind now. It was a book called Why Buddhism is True. And it was basically connecting the core principles of Buddhism to modern psychology and kind of bringing that all together. So it was really interesting.
Cool. Do you know who that's by?
It has slipped my mind right now, but I will tell you after.
Okay, no worries. Question 2, do you have a favorite movie or TV show?
I'll say the TV show that I've probably seen the most is Friends.
Okay, classic.
So good.
Yeah.
Classic.
But by the way, for people who don't know Friends, then I guess now we're dating ourselves.
I don't think we have very many Gen Z watching this podcast, Josh. A good call, yeah. All right, question 3. What is something in healthcare that you believe that others might find insane?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple things for anyone who's not kind of working in the healthcare industry. Just knowing how so much in healthcare is still paper-based, considering how far we are as a society with technology, I do think that that's quite insane. The other one that I would say is how patients have basically no access to their own healthcare information. That's another one I find crazy.
Kayla, what are your thoughts on, actually, I mean, I think you're probably like a patient, you would answer in a way, but I'll ask you anyway. So the notes that your providers write inside like the health record, right? Normally patients don't actually see what you write. I mean, it changes, I think, if you have access to a patient portal, but I think in most places you actually can't see what your providers write. And to be honest, if you could, they might write things differently.
Sure.
What is your take on that? Like, is your take that everyone should be able to see everything, or like, how would you think about how much of that people should see and should worry about what they write, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, the notes is it's an interesting kind of gray area one, because what a provider might write down could be contextual for them to help them remember and understand something. The patient may interpret that differently. I think more so than the notes, what we should have ready access to is, a list of all of our appointments and test results and all of that, which if I wanted to go on and try and figure out what my test results were 3 years ago for something, I would have no idea how to do that.
I think the to your point, sorry, just not go off on a tangent, Alan, but I think the one concern that from the provider's point of view happens when it comes to test results, especially imaging test results, is that depending on which radiologist read your scan, they feel obligated to technically write everything it could be. So if you ever have read like a CT scan or something, you often get things such as, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be cancer, technically, it could be this, could be that, right? And as a patient, when you read it, you go, oh my God, it could be cancer, even though that might be like 0.01% possibility. And if you just, get that email or that message from the patient portal, and then you read it without talking to your provider about that context, that could be maybe psychologically harmful for a patient. But then on the flip side, you're getting that information faster. So it's probably like certain situations where it's like, maybe you kind of want to make sure you're talking to someone about it when you get it. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely.
That's the one interesting one, but I think you're right. In most other cases, like frankly, you should just get it right away.
Or at least have access to it even after you've had that initial conversation with your provider. I think hospitals using those patient portals is a great start, but not everyone is using those. And if you went to a walk-in clinic somewhere, that data isn't connected to your patient portal at a hospital, so it's still really fragmented.
Well, someone's got to keep the paper companies in business.
Yeah, I guess so.
Business.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, and going back to Kayla, your initial answer on that, just the sheer amount of paper that's being used and faxes that are still being used in healthcare is alarming, I think, to other industries, or people might find that insane.
Exactly. No other industry is kind of working this way day to day. So there's a lot of improvements to make.
Yeah. All right, question number 4. Would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
I would say read people's minds. I can't think of a use case for when super speed or strength would help me accomplish something right now.
Don't you fear that you would overuse that power and it would drive you insane? That's my biggest fear.
Definitely, that's definitely a concern. Yeah,
Yeah.
good point.
No, that's a good answer. I like that.
I mean, it was one of the 3 choices.
Well, what would you do with super speed?
I think you might be the first. Is Kayla the first person to pick?
Kayla is, yeah. So a couple of people have said super strength, and I think Josh and I both agreed on super speed last time when we answered it. But I think
what would you do with super speed?
Well, I think Josh's answer was he could run to the grocery store and back really quickly.
Okay.
Super speed.
He could win the Olympics, but just by, yeah. Yeah, there's like small use cases that we thought of.
Oh wait, you'd win every track and field event. I mean, there's so many things you could do. I mean,
but then we took it on like a major tangent. We were saying you can only win by a small margin, otherwise you'll get found out and it'll be a whole ordeal.
Exactly, you have to be sneaky.
All right, last question, Kayla. This is a COVID-19 related question, and fortunately and unfortunately, we have to still ask this question because we're still in this pandemic. So, what is one hobby or activity you've gotten into since the start of the pandemic?
One activity is I recently just got a keyboard for my apartment. I used to play piano growing up, and I haven't played in, I don't know how many years, 5, 7 years now, maybe That's more. Cool. So I got that to try and reintroduce myself to that recently.
Have you found that you have like muscle memory around it, or is it you've completely lost the ability?
Yeah, sometimes it's not. Now I just have to try and relearn how to read music quickly.
Right.
But the muscle memory is pretty good. I'm not one to kind of sound it out. I have to, the way my brain works, I have to study it and memorize it, and then I can play it. Other people are way more talented.
That's great.
So Kayla, what you're saying is that even when it comes to the piano, COVID has brought that digital transformation like 10 years ahead. Like maybe 10 years from now, you were going to finally use a keyboard, but it happened in 2020. It got brought 10 years forward.
Right, sure.
That's incredible.
Yeah. I get it. I mean, you're spending more time at home, gonna pick up an instrument again. No, that's great.
Yeah, why not?
More rational way to look at it, Alan. Yeah, I'll go with your point of view.
All right, that's fantastic. So Kayla, I do want to thank you. Obviously, you're the first guest of 2021. This episode was incredible. I think, taking a look at post-op monitoring, which is super relevant to what we're doing today and what the industry is looking at today, was hugely beneficial for our audience. Josh, I don't know if you have any closing words or remarks.
No, Kayla, thank you so much for doing this. And also because Alan kept saying that you're our first guest of 2021, now we can't rearrange the order of the...
Yeah, we have to release this one first.
Exactly.
Fun fact, Kayla, I've been saying this to every guest for the past week, No, but that's great. Thank you so much for joining, Kayla. Have a great day.
No
Have a
problem.
great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.